On the night of June 9, 1912, in the quiet town of Villisca, something moved through a small white house on East 2nd Street. By sunrise, 8 people would be dead. The windows were covered, the mirrors were draped, and inside an axe rested where it had fallen. Villisca was a modest railroad town in southwestern Iowa, a place of church gatherings, evening socials, and unlocked doors. The Moore family lived in a tidy frame house not far from the tracks. Josiah Moore was a successful businessman, co-owner of a farm implement store. His wife, Sarah, managed the home. They had 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and little Paul. On the evening of June 9th, the family attended Children's Day exercises at the Presbyterian Church. With them were 2 visiting sisters, Lena and Inez Stillinger, friends of Catherine. It was a warm Sunday night. Nothing appeared unusual. The program ended around 9:30 p.m. Neighbors later recalled seeing the Moore family and the Stillinger girls walking home together. Lights were turned down. Curtains were drawn. Sometime after midnight, while the house slept, someone entered. Investigators would later determine that the killer likely hid inside the home before the family returned from church, possibly in the attic. Sometime between midnight and 5:00 a.m., the murderer began upstairs in the master bedroom. Josiah and Sarah Moore were struck repeatedly with an axe, most blows delivered while they lay in bed. The attack was methodical and silent. The killer then moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were killed in their sleep. Finally, the assailant entered the downstairs guest room where Lena and Inez Stillinger lay. Evidence suggested Lena may have awakened. Her body showed signs indicating she might have tried to defend herself. Inez was killed beside her. Afterward, the killer lingered. He covered the victims' faces with bedclothes. He draped clothing over the mirrors. He placed a slab of bacon and a bowl of bloody water on the kitchen table. He locked the doors and slipped away before dawn. The murders were not discovered until late morning. When the Moore family failed to appear for church, neighbors grew concerned. Mary Peckham, a neighbor, knocked on the door but received no answer. Eventually, Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, was summoned with a key. Inside, he made the first grim discovery. Word spread quickly. Within hours, townspeople crowded the yard. The crime scene was compromised almost immediately as neighbors and curious onlookers moved through the house. By afternoon, news of the killings had reached surrounding counties. Iowa was stunned. 8 victims, no clear motive, no obvious suspect. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. Early investigators collected the axe, which belonged to the Moore family. It had been left leaning against a wall in the downstairs guest room. There were signs the killer had washed his hands in the kitchen. A kerosene lamp chimney had been removed and placed at the foot of the bed in one room, possibly to provide light without drawing attention. Authorities considered robbery, but valuables remained untouched. Sexual assault was examined but never conclusively proven. The covering of mirrors and faces suggested ritualistic behavior or an attempt to conceal the horror from view. Attention soon turned to a traveling minister named George Kelly, sometimes known as Reverend Kelly. He had been in Villisca around the time of the murders. Kelly was described as unstable, prone to nervousness, and reportedly fascinated by violent crimes. Witnesses claimed he had behaved strangely during his visit, peering into windows and lingering near the Moore home. Years later, Kelly would confess to the murders, then recant. His confession contained inconsistencies and details that were either publicly known or factually incorrect. He claimed he heard voices and felt compelled by divine instruction. Yet investigators could not firmly place him inside the house that night. Other suspects emerged. Frank Jones, a local businessman and political rival of Josiah Moore, was rumored to have had conflicts with Moore over business and personal matters. Some speculated about hired killers. No evidence ever substantiated these claims. There were also reports of similar axe murders across the Midwest around that time. In some cases, entire families were killed while sleeping, mirrors covered, doors locked from the inside. The similarities raised the possibility of a transient serial killer moving along the rail lines, but coordination between jurisdictions in 1912 was limited. No unified theory was confirmed. The investigation suffered from contamination, conflicting witness statements, and shifting public pressure. Prosecutors attempted to build a case against Kelly. Trials were held. Juries deliberated. Ultimately, no conviction stood. Kelly was acquitted. The house remained. Over time, it became less a home and more a symbol. The Villisca Axe Murders entered American criminal history as one of its most disturbing unsolved cases. 8 victims, a small town, a killer who vanished before sunrise. More than a century later, the questions remain. Did the murderer know the family? Was he hiding in the attic as they returned from church? Was it the work of one man or part of a broader pattern? Why were the mirrors covered? Why did he stay? In Villisca, Iowa, the White House still stands. The events of June 9th and 10th, 1912, have never been fully explained. The case file remains open in the only way it can now, through memory, speculation, and the quiet weight of unanswered questions. In the days that followed the murders in Villisca, the town moved in a state of suspended disbelief. Funerals were arranged quickly. 8 caskets were placed side by side, and the weight of what had happened settled heavily over a community that had rarely locked its doors. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were buried, but the investigation was only beginning. Law enforcement in 1912 lacked many of the forensic tools now considered standard. There was no centralized fingerprint database. Blood typing was in its infancy. Crime scenes were not preserved with modern protocol. By the time professional investigators secured the Moore residence, dozens of townspeople had already walked through it. Footprints overlapped. Objects had been handled. The original positions of certain items were debated almost immediately. Still, some details stood out. The axe, taken from the Moore's own coal shed, bore traces of blood and tissue. The blows had been delivered with extraordinary force. Medical examination suggested that several victims were struck first with the blunt end, possibly to silence them before fatal blows were administered with the blade. This indicated calculation. It also suggested familiarity with the house's layout. The killer moved confidently from room to room in darkness, except for the brief use of lamplight. Food had been eaten in the kitchen after the murders. A plate with crumbs and a partially eaten meal was found. This detail disturbed investigators. It implied composure, time. The killer had not fled in panic. He had lingered. Rumors spread faster than verified facts. In small towns, suspicion rarely remains abstract. It attaches to names. One of the earliest persons of interest was a man named William Mansfield, suspected in other axe murders across the Midwest. Private investigator Wilkerson, hired by Senator Frank Jones, attempted to link Mansfield to Villisca. Similarities between crimes were noted: nighttime attacks, families killed in bed, mirrors covered. But Mansfield was eventually ruled out due to alibi evidence placing him in another state at the time. The focus returned to Reverend George Kelly. Kelly had arrived in Villisca days before the murders to conduct church-related business. He was described as socially awkward, with intense eyes and erratic behavior. After the killings, he reportedly sent peculiar letters to investigators and acquaintances, expressing anxiety and religious confusion. Some believed his writings bordered on confession. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested. During interrogation, he confessed. He provided a narrative of entering the Moore home and committing the murders under divine command. Yet his confession raised doubts. Certain details were inaccurate. Some aspects mirrored newspaper reports rather than undisclosed evidence. Observers questioned whether Kelly's mental instability made him suggestible under pressure. At trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on the confession. The defense attacked its reliability. Witnesses described Kelly as nervous, prone to hallucinations, and eager to please authority figures. After lengthy deliberation, the jury failed to convict. A second trial ended in acquittal. Kelly walked free. With each failed prosecution, public confidence weakened. The case began to fracture into competing theories. Some residents believed Josiah Moore had been targeted specifically. As a businessman, he had previously worked for Frank Jones before establishing his own store. Their relationship reportedly deteriorated. Allegations of financial disputes and personal grievances circulated, yet no concrete evidence tied Jones, or anyone acting on his behalf, to the crime. These claims remained within the realm of speculation, fueled by rivalry and grief rather than documented proof. Other investigators examined the possibility of a transient killer moving along railroad lines. In the early 1900s, rail networks connected rural towns across multiple states. A drifter could arrive unnoticed and leave before suspicion formed. Similar family murders occurred in Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois around that era. The parallels were unsettling but not definitive. Without coordinated record sharing, law enforcement agencies struggled to confirm patterns. The detail of the covered mirrors remained one of the most haunting elements. Some interpreted it as ritualistic. Others suggested it was practical, preventing the killer from seeing his own reflection in lamplight. The act of covering victims' faces could indicate remorse, or simply an attempt to distance oneself from the violence committed. Motive cannot be measured directly. It must be inferred from behavior. And in Villisca, behavior offered more questions than answers. The timeline of the murders also posed challenges. The town had active railroad traffic during the night. Some witnesses reported hearing unusual sounds, but none investigated at the time. Dogs did not bark. No one reported screams. The killer's ability to move through 8 murders without alerting neighbors suggested either remarkable control or extraordinary luck. In the years that followed, the house at 508 East 2nd Street became a site of quiet notoriety. Families avoided speaking of it openly. Children were warned not to approach. The structure itself remained largely unchanged, a physical reminder of unresolved violence. Over time, as original witnesses passed away and physical evidence deteriorated, the case shifted from active investigation to historical mystery. Law enforcement periodically reviewed the file, but without preserved biological samples suitable for modern DNA testing, progress was limited. The Villisca Axe Murders stand today as one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. 8 lives ended in a span of hours. No robbery, no clear motive, a suspect who confessed but could not be conclusively linked, a town that never fully recovered its sense of security. In examining the record, investigators are left with fragments. A borrowed axe, a covered mirror, a bowl of bloody water, a preacher's confession, a rival's rumored grudge, the echo of footsteps on wooden stairs. The passage of time has not clarified the truth. It has only hardened the silence around it. More than a century later, the questions persist in the quiet rooms of that house in Villisca. Who waited in the dark? Who moved from bed to bed before dawn? And how did they step back into the world unnoticed, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries of 1912? As the months turned into years, the murders in Villisca began to shift from immediate horror to unresolved legacy. The original investigators were replaced. County officials changed. Witnesses moved away or died. But the case file remained thick with statements, diagrams, and speculation. One detail that continued to trouble investigators was the sequence of events inside the house. The killer appeared to have moved with intention, beginning in the master bedroom and ending downstairs. The positioning of the bodies suggested the murderer returned to some rooms more than once, striking additional blows after the initial attack. This overkill was not required to ensure death. It suggested something else: anger, compulsion, or fear of leaving survivors. In the Stillinger girls' room, the scene was slightly different. Lena Stillinger's body was found partially off the bed, her nightgown disturbed. Investigators at the time debated whether this indicated a struggle or post-mortem staging. The kerosene lamp chimney placed at the foot of the bed may have provided just enough light for the killer to see without illuminating the house from outside. It was a small but telling adjustment. Whoever committed the crime understood how to navigate darkness without drawing attention. Outside, the town tried to rebuild normalcy. Businesses reopened. Church services resumed. Yet Villisca no longer felt untouched. Doors were locked more frequently. Suspicion lingered in everyday interactions. In a rural community where trust was assumed, the knowledge that someone could enter a home, kill 8 people, and vanish without consequence created a lasting fracture. Attention periodically returned to Reverend George Kelly. After his acquittal, he continued to preach sporadically and lived quietly. Some believed the jury had erred. Others felt the prosecution had relied too heavily on a confession extracted from a mentally unstable man. Kelly's writings, filled with religious imagery and anxiety, were interpreted both as evidence of guilt and as proof of fragility. The ambiguity surrounding him mirrored the ambiguity of the case itself. There were alternative theories that never gained formal traction but persisted in private conversation. One theory suggested the killer may have been familiar with the more household routines, aware that the family would attend church that evening, aware that 2 additional children were staying overnight. This implied surveillance or prior contact, yet no credible evidence of stalking was documented. Another possibility was opportunity rather than premeditation. The house, like many in 1912, was not secured in modern fashion. A transient individual could have entered unnoticed. The attic showed signs that someone may have been there, including cigarette butts. However, contamination of the scene made it impossible to determine when those items were left. Law enforcement at the time faced structural limitations. Communication between states was slow. Criminal records were decentralized. If the murderer was a drifter who boarded a train before sunrise, he could have crossed state lines within hours. Similar axe murders reported in other Midwestern communities were investigated independently. Whether they were connected remains uncertain. Psychological profile of the killer, as later analysts attempted to reconstruct it, suggested patience and control. The offender selected a time when the victims were vulnerable. He used a weapon found on the property, minimizing the need to carry evidence away. He attempted basic cleanup, washing his hands and possibly the axe. He covered mirrors and faces, behaviors that might indicate ritual, shame, or superstition. He avoided waking neighbors. He left before daylight exposed him. What remains unclear is motive. There was no theft of significance, no documented financial desperation, no known personal vendetta conclusively established. Without motive, the crime resists closure. In the decades that followed, the Moore house changed ownership several times. Interest in the case revived periodically, especially during anniversaries. Amateur investigators revisited old transcripts. Writers examined archived newspapers. The narrative evolved, but the core facts did not. 8 victims, 1 weapon, no conviction. The Villisca Axe murders endure not because of spectacle but because of restraint. The killer did not boast. He did not write taunting letters. He did not reappear in Villisca. If he committed other crimes, they were not definitively linked. If he lived an ordinary life afterward, no record ties him back to that June night. In examining the case today, historians and criminologists often return to the same unanswered points. Why were the mirrors covered so deliberately? Why remain in the house long enough to eat? Why risk additional noise by striking repeated blows? These behaviors suggest a complex internal state, part composure, part compulsion. The town of Villisca still remembers. The house remains standing, preserved as a historical site. Visitors walk through the narrow staircase, the small bedrooms, the kitchen where the bowl once sat. The structure itself offers no confession. Wood and plaster do not reveal memory. More than a century later, the silence is intact. The events of June 9 and 10, 1912, exist in documented fragments, coroner reports, trial transcripts, faded photographs. They form a record without resolution. And in that unresolved space, the Villisca Axe Murders continue to occupy a place in American criminal history defined not by what is known, but by what has never been proven. As the investigation drifted further from the summer of 1912, the case in Villisca began to settle into two parallel tracks: the official record and the unofficial memory carried by those who lived in its shadow. Officially, the file contained witness statements describing a quiet night. Railroad workers reported routine train passages. Neighbors recalled nothing more than the ordinary sounds of a small town settling into sleep. No credible sighting placed a stranger fleeing the area at dawn. No blood trail led away from the house. There were no fingerprints preserved in a way that could later be verified. The axe, though central to the crime, yielded nothing that could identify its user. Unofficially, however, stories multiplied. Some residents insisted they had heard something, a faint thud, a dog barking briefly, footsteps in gravel, but had dismissed it at the time. Others claimed to have seen a man loitering near the Moore home in the days before the murders. Descriptions varied. Height changed. Clothing shifted. Memory, shaped by trauma and repetition, became unreliable. Investigators revisited the layout of the house repeatedly. The staircase creaked in certain places. Floorboards carried sound. To move from room to room without waking anyone required either exceptional care or prior knowledge of which boards to avoid. The theory that the killer had concealed himself in the attic gained traction because it explained both access and timing. If the murderer entered before the family returned from church, he would have had hours to study the house in darkness. Cigarette butts discovered in the attic were examined, though in 1912 such evidence offered little forensic value. It was noted that Josiah Moore did not smoke that brand, yet the attic had been accessible to previous occupants and visitors. Without a reliable chain of custody, the significance of the butts remained uncertain. Attention also returned to the condition of the doors. Some reports suggested they were locked from the inside when neighbors attempted entry. Others indicated that keys were used to gain access. The distinction mattered. If locked from within, the killer may have exited through a window, but no clear signs of forced entry or exit were documented. The ambiguity fed speculation. Reverend George Kelly remained the most publicly recognized suspect. Analysts later scrutinized his confession transcripts. Portions were rambling, filled with religious references and emotional distress. He described moving through the house and hearing voices that guided him, yet key details conflicted with known evidence. He misstated room arrangements and victim positions. Some believed he constructed his account from newspaper descriptions, consciously or unconsciously incorporating widely reported facts. The prosecution's reliance on his confession revealed the desperation of authorities to resolve the case. By the time of his arrest, public patience had worn thin. An unsolved massacre challenged not only local law enforcement but the broader perception of safety in rural America. A conviction, even if imperfect, would have restored a sense of order, but the jury's refusal to convict underscored reasonable doubt. Other names appeared briefly in investigative notes: transients arrested for unrelated offenses, men with histories of violence, individuals passing through on freight trains. None could be definitively connected to the Moore household on that specific night. The broader context of early 20th century America is relevant. This was a period of increased mobility. Railroads linked distant towns. Seasonal laborers moved frequently. Record-keeping was inconsistent. If the Villisca murderer was itinerant, tracing his path would have required coordination that simply did not exist at the time. Modern criminologists reviewing the case often analyze behavioral elements. The covering of mirrors is interpreted in multiple ways. Some suggest it indicates an offender who could not tolerate his own reflection after committing violence. Others argue it may have been practical, reducing visual stimuli in low light. The act of covering victims' faces has been associated in other cases with personal connection or remorse, but it can also serve to depersonalize the act for the killer. The decision to use a household weapon also carries dual interpretations. It may signal spontaneity, an opportunistic crime committed with what was available, or it may indicate deliberate planning, reducing the risk of being caught carrying a weapon into or out of town. Another unresolved question concerns sequence. Why begin upstairs? Why not attack the children first? One possibility is that the killer prioritized eliminating the adults to prevent resistance. This suggests rational planning, yet the excessive number of blows delivered complicates the portrait of calm calculation. The violence was controlled in execution but extreme in intensity. As decades passed, advancements in forensic science prompted occasional calls to reopen the case. However, the preservation of physical evidence from 1912 was limited. Biological samples were not stored in conditions suitable for modern DNA extraction. The house itself, while structurally intact, could not yield conclusive new data. Time had eroded the material record. The Moore and Stillinger families' descendants carried the weight of unresolved grief. Without a definitive perpetrator, there was no formal acknowledgement of responsibility. The narrative remained incomplete. Public interest resurged periodically, especially as true crime scholarship expanded. The Villisca Axe murders were cited alongside other unsolved family annihilations of the era. Comparative analysis highlighted similarities but stopped short of confirming a single offender. Patterns can suggest possibility. They cannot substitute for proof. In Villisca, the house became less a private residence and more a historical artifact. Its narrow rooms, modest kitchen, and steep staircase are ordinary by architectural standards. That ordinariness is part of what continues to unsettle observers. The crime did not occur in isolation or wilderness. It occurred in a family home after a church service, within sight of neighbors. The endurance of the mystery lies in its restraint. There were no dramatic chases, no public taunts, no definitive forensic breakthroughs, just a quiet town, a single night, and 8 lives ended before morning. The final official outcome remains unchanged. No one was convicted for the murders committed on June 9 and 10, 1912. Reverend Kelly was acquitted. Other suspects were investigated and dismissed. The case remains legally unresolved. And so the file closes where it began: a date, a location, and a sequence of actions carried out in darkness. The White House in Villisca stands as it did more than a century ago. Wood floors, modest bedrooms, windows that once faced an ordinary Iowa street. What happened inside is documented in fragments. Who did it remains unproven. The silence that followed the killer out the door before sunrise has never been broken. In the years after the trials concluded and public attention shifted elsewhere, the murders in Villisca settled into the category of unresolved history. Yet for investigators who periodically revisited the file, the case never truly closed. It remained a study in missed opportunity, compromised evidence, and the limits of early 20th century policing. One recurring point of analysis centered on timing. Medical examiners in 1912 could only estimate time of death based on body temperature and rigor mortis, methods imprecise even under ideal conditions. The prevailing estimate placed the murders between midnight and 5:00 a.m. That window overlaps with several passing trains. Some researchers later proposed that the killer may have timed his exit to coincide with a freight train's departure, using the noise as cover. If he boarded a rail car, he could have been miles away before the town awoke. The geography of Villisca supports that possibility. The railroad was not distant. Its presence was part of daily life. A man walking calmly toward the tracks before dawn might not have drawn suspicion. Early risers preparing for farm work or deliveries would not necessarily question someone moving with purpose. Another detail that drew attention was the positioning of the kerosene lamps. In at least one bedroom, the chimney had been removed and placed at the foot of the bed. Removing the chimney dims the flame and reduces smoke visibility. This suggests the killer wanted light, but only enough to see. It reflects control. He was not rushing blindly. He was managing his environment. The act of washing up in the kitchen also invites scrutiny. A bowl of bloody water was found, along with a towel. Some investigators interpreted this as practical. Clean hands reduce the chance of leaving obvious traces in public. Others saw it as an indication that the killer expected to interact with the outside world immediately afterward. A man covered in visible blood would attract attention. A man who had taken time to wash might not. Re-examinations of Reverend George Kelly continued sporadically throughout the 20th century. His movements in the days before and after the murders were mapped as thoroughly as surviving records allowed. Witnesses placed him in town, but not definitively at the Moore house during the critical hours. His departure schedule did not conclusively align with a rapid escape, yet travel records from that era are incomplete. Psychological interpretations of Kelly vary. Some analysts argue that his unstable mental state and fixation on religious themes made him capable of extreme acts. Others counter that his behavior fits the pattern of a suggestible individual who internalized public suspicion and shaped his confession accordingly. The absence of unique, undisclosed details in his confession remains a significant weakness in the case against him. Meanwhile, the theory of a broader series of axe murders continued to circulate. Similar crimes in Colorado Springs and other Midwestern towns shared surface characteristics: nighttime attacks, families killed in bed, use of a household axe covered faces. However, closer examination reveals differences in entry methods, victim demographics, and post-crime behavior. Without forensic linkage, the connection remains hypothetical. The Moore house itself became an object of layered interpretation. Architectural analysis shows narrow hallways and close quarters. Sound would travel, but perhaps not as dramatically as assumed. Rural night noise, wind, distant livestock, the occasional passing train could mask subtle disturbances. The first blow in each room, delivered with the blunt side of the axe, likely minimized immediate screams. If victims were struck swiftly and decisively, the window for audible alarm would have been brief. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is its stillness. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture suggesting chaotic struggle. The beds remained largely in place. This controlled environment stands in contrast to the brutality inflicted within it. Over time, historians began to view the Villisca murders not only as a criminal mystery, but as a cultural turning point. Rural communities in early 20th century America often operated on implicit trust. Doors were unlocked. Neighbors moved freely between homes. The realization that violence could arrive quietly and without warning challenged that sense of security. Local records show that in the years following 1912, more residents began installing sturdier locks. Firearms ownership increased modestly. Though not formally documented as a direct response, the timing suggests a shift in mindset. The absence of resolution also influenced how the crime was remembered. Without a convicted perpetrator, narrative space remained open. Writers and amateur investigators filled that space with competing reconstructions. Some portrayed the killer as a calculating drifter, others as a known figure shielded by influence. Each theory attempts to impose coherence on an event that resists it. Modern forensic specialists occasionally assess whether any preserved artifacts could yield new insight. The primary challenge is degradation. Organic material from 1912, unless meticulously preserved, is unlikely to provide usable DNA. Handling by numerous individuals further complicates contamination issues. Even if biological traces were found, the absence of a known suspect's comparative sample would limit conclusions. Thus, the case persists in a narrow corridor between history and speculation. The victims remain central to the file. Josiah Moore, 43, Sarah Moore, 39, Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, Paul, 5, Lena Stillinger, 12, Inez Stillinger, 8. Their lives are often reduced to a single night, yet they existed beyond it: schoolwork, business ledgers, church recitals, ordinary routines. The abruptness of their deaths contributes to the enduring weight of the story. Visitors who walk through the preserved house often remark on its scale. The rooms are smaller than expected, the staircase narrower, the distance from bedroom to bedroom minimal. The intimacy of the space emphasizes how close the killer was to each victim in turn. In reviewing the official documents, one senses both diligence and limitation. Investigators followed leads available to them. They interviewed suspects, convened grand juries, held trials. Yet they operated within a framework constrained by the era's technology and procedure. The final pages of the case file do not contain a definitive answer. They contain summaries, acquittal records, and archived correspondence. The legal system concluded its active pursuit decades ago. Historically, the matter remains open. And so the narrative returns again to the same unresolved core. A quiet Sunday evening in June 1912, a house darkened after church, and an individual who entered or waited within moved deliberately from room to room, and left before daylight revealed the aftermath. The town of Villisca continues forward in time. The house remains a structure of wood and memory. The questions endure not because they are dramatic, but because they are simple. Who did it? And why? As the decades continue to pass, the Villisca file transformed from an active criminal investigation into a historical inquiry. Yet even in archival form, the murders in Villisca resist final interpretation. Each generation that reopens the record brings new methods of analysis, but encounters the same fixed boundary: the absence of conclusive evidence. One area that continues to draw scrutiny is offender behavior after the crime. In many homicide cases, perpetrators display patterns: boasting, fleeing abruptly, committing similar acts again. In Villisca, there is no confirmed continuation. If the murderer killed again, the link has never been proven. If he did not, then the question becomes more complex. Was this an isolated eruption, or a single documented incident within a larger, undetected pattern? Behavioral analysts examining the case often separate the crime into phases: entry, control, execution, post-offense activity, and exit. Entry shows minimal disturbance, suggesting either familiarity or patience. Control was established quickly through incapacitating blows. Execution was systematic, room by room. Post-offense activity included covering mirrors and faces, washing, and possibly eating. Exit appears calm and undetected. The post-offense phase remains the most psychologically revealing. Covering mirrors may reflect superstition, self-avoidance, or ritual. Covering victims' faces can indicate depersonalization, shame, or simply a habitual act seen in other crimes of the era. None of these interpretations can be confirmed. They are frameworks applied after the fact. The possibility that the killer remained inside the house for an extended period continues to unsettle researchers. The bowl of bloody water, the repositioned lamp chimney, the partially consumed food, these details suggest time spent beyond what was strictly necessary. That time implies confidence. Confidence implies either familiarity with the environment or belief in the improbability of interruption. Reverend George Kelly remains the only individual to have formally confessed, however inconsistently. His acquittal closed the legal path against him, but not public suspicion. Some historians argue that the confession, though flawed, contained emotional authenticity. Others maintain that it lacked the concrete, non-public details expected from a true perpetrator. Without physical evidence tying him to the scene, his role remains unproven. There is also the persistent question of motive tied specifically to Josiah Moore. If the murders were personal, why were the children and guests killed as well? Eliminating witnesses explains part of it, but the scale suggests something broader than a targeted grievance. If the motive was random or opportunistic, the thoroughness becomes more difficult to explain. 8 victims increase risk. The offender accepted that risk. The Stillinger sisters' presence adds another layer. Their overnight stay was not unusual, but it expanded the number of victims unexpectedly. If the killer planned the attack in advance, he may not have known they would be there. If he discovered them only after entering, he adapted. That adaptation would indicate composure under changing circumstances. Over time, the house itself has been preserved as a site of memory. Its continued existence allows physical context to inform interpretation. Visitors can stand in the upstairs hallway and consider how narrow it is. They can observe how close the bedrooms are to one another. They can look out the windows and see how visible the house is from the street. These observations reinforce how ordinary the setting was. Ordinary settings intensify unresolved crimes. There is no remote wilderness to blame. No chaotic urban anonymity, just a small town, a family home, and a night indistinguishable from others until morning came. The endurance of the Villisca Axe Murders in historical discourse stems partly from that ordinariness and partly from the procedural failures that followed. Contaminated evidence, overlapping jurisdictional authority, public pressure shaping investigative direction. A confession obtained years later without corroboration. Each factor contributed to uncertainty that could not be undone. If modern forensic tools had been available, DNA analysis, standardized fingerprint databases, structured crime scene preservation, the outcome might have differed, or it might not have. Some crimes remain resistant even to advanced technology when critical evidence is lost early. The file now stands as both a criminal mystery and a lesson in investigative evolution. It illustrates how fragile the path to resolution can be when early steps are compromised. The names of the victims remain documented in local records and memorials. Their ages at the time of death underscore the human cost behind the speculation. For Villisca, the murders were not an abstract puzzle. They were a rupture in community continuity. And so the narrative arrives again at its central absence. There is no signed confession supported by irrefutable proof, no preserved fingerprint match decades later, no overlooked witness emerging with definitive clarity. There is only a collection of details fixed in 1912 and interpreted repeatedly since. On the night of June 9, 1912, someone moved deliberately through a small house in Villisca. By sunrise, 8 people were dead. Before the town fully understood what had happened, the person responsible was gone. More than a century later, that departure remains complete. The question endures, not because it is dramatic, but because it is unanswered. Who walked out of that house before dawn and carried the secret for the rest of their life? As interest in early American homicide cases expanded in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the murders in Villisca were revisited with renewed academic and investigative attention. Historians, criminologists, and independent researchers began examining not only who might have committed the crime, but how the original inquiry unfolded and where it faltered. One of the most significant procedural failures was the immediate contamination of the crime scene. In 1912, the concept of perimeter control was not firmly established in rural jurisdictions. After the bodies were discovered, neighbors, townspeople, and even local officials entered the Moore residence. Some moved objects, others touched walls, bedding, and door handles. The sheer number of individuals present in the house, before structured documentation occurred, rendered later physical analysis uncertain. Photographs were taken, but photographic documentation at the time lacked the systematic coverage expected today. Angles were limited. Lighting was inconsistent. Certain rooms were captured only partially. These images would later serve as primary visual evidence, but they could not compensate for the loss of undisturbed conditions. The medical examinations conducted on the victims were also constrained by the standards of the era. Autopsies focused on cause of death rather than minute trace evidence. The overwhelming trauma from the axe blows was evident. Less obvious forensic indicators, such as microscopic fibers or biological transfer, were not recoverable with available methods. Despite these limitations, the investigative record reflects sustained effort. Leads were pursued beyond Iowa. Suspects were tracked across state lines. Grand juries convened. Yet each avenue eventually encountered insufficient proof. The case against Reverend George Kelly remains the most formally developed prosecution. His arrest in 1917 was not arbitrary. It followed years of suspicion, strange correspondence, and reports of erratic behavior. Kelly's confession described entering the Moore house and carrying out the murders under perceived divine instruction. However, legal scrutiny revealed inconsistencies. His narrative lacked exclusive knowledge. Some statements appeared shaped by newspaper coverage that had circulated widely since 1912. At trial, the defense emphasized the possibility of coercion or psychological vulnerability. Testimony highlighted Kelly's fragile mental state. Ultimately, jurors were not convinced beyond reasonable doubt. His acquittal marked the end of the most concentrated legal effort to resolve the case. Parallel to the Kelly investigation, private detectives explored the theory of a hired killer connected to Josiah Moore's former employer and rival. Financial and personal disputes were examined. Allegations of romantic involvement and business competition were scrutinized, yet no documentary or physical evidence substantiated a contract killing. These suspicions persisted largely through rumor and local rivalry rather than verified fact. Another dimension of analysis considers the social climate of 1912 America. The early 20th century was marked by transient labor, economic fluctuation, and limited interagency communication. A person moving from town to town could leave minimal trace. If the Villisca offender was itinerant, he may have blended into the larger pattern of anonymous mobility common to the period. Comparisons to other axe murders from the same era continue to generate discussion. Some cases share notable elements: nighttime entry, use of a household axe, victims attacked while sleeping. However, differences in victim profiles and crime scene details complicate efforts to assert a single perpetrator. Without preserved forensic linkage, the connection remains speculative. Behavioral analysis, while useful in modern profiling, cannot substitute for evidence. Experts examining the Villisca murders often emphasize the offender's apparent organization. He selected a vulnerable time. He navigated the house methodically. He attempted minimal cleanup. He exited without detection. These behaviors align with what would now be termed an organized offender, yet the intense violence inflicted suggests emotional or psychological intensity beyond detached calculation. The covered mirrors continue to invite interpretation. In some cultural traditions, mirrors are covered after death to prevent spirits from being trapped. Whether the killer held such beliefs is unknown. The act could also represent a personal aversion to reflection or simply a practical measure to reduce visibility. Without testimony, motive remains interpretive. The Moore house, preserved into the modern era, allows ongoing physical examination of space and acoustics. Researchers have tested how sound travels from room to room. While creaks and footfalls are audible under quiet conditions, a decisive incapacitating blow could silence a victim quickly. The absence of confirmed screams suggests the first strikes were effective. Community memory in Villisca evolved from shock to guarded reflection. For decades, residents avoided public discussion. The crime was known, but not openly dissected. Only later did historical framing allow the event to be studied with some distance. Today, the case occupies a distinct place in American criminal history. It illustrates the transition between eras of law enforcement, before standardized forensic science, before centralized criminal databases, before coordinated national investigations. It stands at the intersection of rural trust and emerging modern crime. The victims' lives are preserved in census records, school documents, church programs, and family histories. They are not abstractions. They were individuals whose routines on June 9, 1912, followed familiar patterns: church attendance, conversation with neighbors, children preparing for summer. By the morning of June 10th, that continuity was irreversibly broken. The enduring nature of the Villisca Axe murders lies not in sensationalism, but in incompletion. There is no final arrest record, no definitive confession supported by corroborating evidence, no forensic breakthrough emerging decades later. The official conclusion remains unchanged. The perpetrator was never conclusively identified or convicted. As researchers continue to review archives, the possibility of new insight diminishes with time. Physical evidence has aged beyond practical testing. Witnesses are long gone. The crime scene, though structurally intact, cannot reproduce its original state. What remains is the documented sequence. A Sunday evening in early June, a family returning from church, lights extinguished, and sometime after midnight, a series of deliberate movements through darkened rooms. When dawn came to Villisca, 8 people were dead, before the town fully understood what had occurred. The individual responsible had already stepped back into ordinary life, unrecognized, unproven, unnamed. And more than a century later, the silence surrounding that departure remains the final entry in the file. In the absence of resolution, the Villisca file eventually became something more than a criminal record. It became a study in uncertainty, how communities respond when violence arrives without explanation, and how history preserves what law enforcement could not finalize. In Villisca, daily life continued in the years after 1912, but the murders altered the town's psychological landscape. Families who once left doors unlocked began securing them at night. Parents who had trusted the quiet rhythms of rural life became more cautious. The sense that danger belonged elsewhere, larger cities, distant places, no longer held. For investigators reviewing the case decades later, one recurring question concerned intent. Was the killer focused specifically on Josiah Moore, with the rest eliminated as witnesses? Or was the entire household the objective from the beginning? The distinction matters. A targeted grievance suggests motive anchored in personal conflict. A full family annihilation without theft or clear provocation suggests something more detached, perhaps even compulsive. The more children's ages, 11, 10, 7, and 5, underscore the indiscriminate nature of the violence. The Stillinger sisters, 12 and 8, were guests. Their presence expanded the number of victims beyond the immediate family. If the killer knew they were there, it implies foreknowledge of household arrangements. If he did not, it implies adaptability under unexpected conditions. Either scenario points to a composed offender capable of adjusting in real time. Reverend George Kelly remains central to discussions not because he was proven guilty, but because he represents the closest the legal system came to a formal resolution. His confession, later withdrawn, is studied line by historians seeking indicators of authenticity. Some passages describe emotional turmoil, others appear rehearsed. Without corroborating evidence, interpretation remains divided. Beyond Kelly, the broader suspect pool reflects the limitations of early 20th century investigative networks. Drifters, railroad workers, traveling salesmen, individuals who passed through town without permanent ties were difficult to track. Identification documents were minimal. Background checks, as understood today, did not exist. A person could disappear into the rail system and leave few records behind. The house at 508 East 2nd Street stands as a preserved structure, allowing modern observers to confront the physical environment in which the murders occurred. Its modest size often surprises visitors. The proximity of bedrooms challenges assumptions about sound and awareness. Standing in the narrow hallway, one can measure the short distance between rooms and imagine how quickly events unfolded. Yet imagination cannot replace evidence. Over time, technological advancements in forensic science have solved cases once thought impossible. DNA databases have identified perpetrators decades after crimes were committed. However, such breakthroughs rely on preserved biological material. In Villisca, evidence handling in 1912 did not anticipate future scientific capabilities. Whatever trace material existed was compromised or lost. The enduring mystery lies partly in this intersection between possibility and absence. It is conceivable that the murderer left recoverable biological traces. It is equally possible that those traces were destroyed by early contamination. The gap between what might have been known and what was preserved remains one of the case's most significant obstacles. Cultural memory continues to revisit the crime. Writers analyze newspaper archives. Researchers compare timelines. Amateur investigators map train routes and suspect movements. Each re-examination produces hypotheses, but none reach definitive proof. What distinguishes the Villisca Axe murders from many other unsolved cases is their contained scale. The crime was both intimate and complete. 8 victims within one household, one night, one weapon, no confirmed repetition in the same town. The event stands isolated yet profound. The official outcome remains unchanged. No individual was convicted for the murders committed on June 9 and 10, 1912. The legal system exhausted its viable avenues within the constraints of its time. More than a century later, the narrative returns again to the same quiet image. A small Iowa town at rest, a house darkened after church, and a figure moving deliberately through sleeping rooms before dawn. When morning came, the house revealed its devastation. By the time investigators assembled theories, the person responsible had already stepped beyond reach. The file concludes without naming a perpetrator. And so the case endures, not as spectacle, but as a measured record of violence without resolution, preserved in documents, in memory, and in the continued absence of a final answer. In the long arc of American criminal history, there are cases that close with a verdict and cases that close only because time has exhausted the available paths. The murders in Villisca belong to the latter category, not for lack of effort, but because each line of inquiry eventually narrowed into uncertainty. As archivists and researchers revisited original transcripts, one element became increasingly clear. The investigation unfolded under intense public scrutiny. Newspapers from Iowa and surrounding states reported developments quickly and sometimes speculatively. Details from inside the Moore home were printed within days. This widespread publication complicated later prosecutions. Any suspect who followed coverage could incorporate publicly known facts into a confession, intentionally or not. That dynamic weighed heavily on the case against Reverend George Kelly. When he confessed in 1917, nearly 5 years after the murders, the public record was extensive. Defense attorneys argued that Kelly's statements mirrored information already printed. Prosecutors countered that certain elements suggested personal involvement. The debate highlighted a core challenge: distinguishing knowledge gained through experience from knowledge absorbed through media. The role of private investigators further complicated matters. Competing interests funded parallel inquiries. Some sought evidence linking the crime to business rivalries. Others pursued transient suspects connected to similar murders elsewhere. These efforts occasionally produced dramatic claims, but rarely durable proof. In some instances, Allegations were made publicly before being substantiated, deepening divisions within the community. The physical evidence, limited as it was, offered only partial clarity. The axe belonged to the Moore household. There was no indication it had been brought from outside. That fact suggests the killer either knew where to find it or discovered it after entering the property. The absence of forced entry implies either unlocked access or a concealed presence before the family returned home. The attic theory persists because it reconciles several factors. If the murderer entered during daylight or early evening and hid above, he would not need to risk external entry at night. He could wait, listen, and descend when the house settled. Investigators noted signs that someone may have been in the attic space, yet conclusive proof was lacking. Cigarette remnants, though suspicious, could not be definitively dated. Sound analysis remains central to modern discussions. The first blow delivered to each victim appears to have been decisive. Medical reports describe extensive cranial trauma. If victims were rendered unconscious immediately, the opportunity for alarm would have been brief. The killer's choice to use the blunt end first, in some cases, may have been strategic, minimizing blood spray and noise before delivering fatal strikes with the blade. The Stillinger sisters' room remains one of the most discussed scenes in the house. Lena's position suggested she may have awakened or partially risen. Whether this indicates recognition of danger or reflexive movement cannot be known. What is clear is that the offender did not abandon the attack even when conditions shifted. The presence of 2 additional victims did not deter completion. The covering of mirrors continues to resist definitive explanation. Cultural interpretations vary. Some scholars point to superstitions surrounding death. Others suggest psychological avoidance, removing reflective surfaces to prevent confrontation with one's own image. It is also possible the act was practical, reducing light reflection and visibility from outside windows. Without direct testimony, motive remains interpretive. As forensic science evolved through the 20th century, fingerprinting standards, blood typing, DNA analysis, the Villisca case became an example often cited in discussions of evidence preservation. Had modern protocols existed in 1912, the outcome might have differed, or it might not have. Even today, some cases lack sufficient biological material for testing. The early contamination in Villisca ensures that certainty is unlikely. The Moore and Stillinger families are memorialized not only through historical records, but through the continued retelling of the case. Their daily lives, church attendance, school activities, business responsibilities, form the context that makes the crime stark. There was no visible prelude of escalating threats, no documented warning signs that violence was imminent. That absence complicates motive analysis. Crimes driven by financial gain typically involve theft. Crimes rooted in personal vendetta often produce evidence of conflict. Crimes of opportunity may involve a single victim rather than 8. The Villisca murders combine elements that resist simple categorization. Over time, the house itself became a preserved site. Its rooms remain arranged much as they were in 1912. Visitors observe the narrow staircase, the proximity of beds, the small kitchen. The ordinariness of the setting reinforces the unsettling reality. Extraordinary violence occurred in an unremarkable space. Legal closure never arrived. After Reverend Kelly's acquittal, prosecutorial momentum diminished. Without new suspects supported by evidence, authorities had little basis for further trials. The file transitioned from active investigation to archival record. Yet the unanswered questions remain direct and uncomplicated. Who entered the Moore home that night? Was he a stranger passing through or someone familiar to the family? Did he act alone? Did he commit similar acts elsewhere, undetected or unlinked? Or did he carry this single crime as a lifelong secret? In examining the Villisca Axe murders, historians often conclude not with revelation, but with recognition of limitation. The case reflects both the determination of early investigators and the structural constraints they faced. It stands as a reminder that justice depends not only on truth, but on the ability to prove it. On June 9, 1912, a family returned from church in a quiet Iowa town. Before sunrise, 8 lives ended within the walls of their home. The person responsible left no confirmed identity behind. More than a century later, the file remains open in one essential sense. Not legally active, but unresolved. Preserved in transcripts and testimony, in preserved rooms and recorded names. The silence that followed the killer out the door has never been broken. In the end, what remains of the Villisca case is not a revelation, but a record. On June 9, 1912, the Moore family returned to their home in Villisca after an ordinary Sunday evening at church. With them were 2 young guests. The lamps were lowered, curtains were drawn. The town settled into sleep. Sometime after midnight, an individual either entered the house or emerged from concealment within it. By dawn, 8 people were dead. The investigation that followed reflected both urgency and limitation. Local officials worked within the standards available to them. They interviewed neighbors. They cataloged what physical evidence they could preserve. They tracked suspects across state lines. Yet the scene had been compromised within hours. The boundaries of forensic science were narrow. Public pressure was immediate and intense. The axe taken from the Moore property became the central artifact of the crime. Its presence suggested proximity and opportunity rather than elaborate preparation. The covered mirrors and faces introduced psychological complexity that investigators could not definitively decode. The bowl of bloody water in the kitchen indicated time spent inside after the violence concluded. Each detail added dimension. None provided identity. The prosecution of Reverend George Kelly represented the closest approach to legal resolution. His confession, delivered years after the murders, created a narrative that seemed to answer lingering questions. Yet under scrutiny, the confession proved unstable. Inconsistencies and reliance on publicly known details weakened its force. Jurors ultimately declined to convict. With that acquittal, the strongest formal case dissolved. Other theories, business rivalry, hired killers, transient serial offenders, surfaced and receded. Some were fueled by local tensions. Others emerged from attempts to connect Villisca to broader patterns of similar crimes in the Midwest. None achieved evidentiary confirmation. As decades passed, witnesses died, physical evidence deteriorated, and the possibility of direct resolution narrowed further. What endures is the structure itself. The Moore house still stands on East 2nd Street. Its rooms are modest. The staircase remains narrow. The distance between bedrooms is short. Observers who walk through it confront the tangible scale of the crime. 8 lives were taken within a space not much larger than many modern apartments. The proximity underscores the calculated movement of the offender from room to room. Modern forensic science, had it been available and properly applied in 1912, might have altered the outcome. DNA databases have solved cases older than Villisca, but such solutions require preserved biological material and documented chains of custody. In this case, contamination and time have erased that possibility. The evidence that could have identified a perpetrator may have existed briefly. It does not exist now in usable form. The Villisca Axe murders occupy a particular place in American criminal history because they represent a convergence of factors: a rural setting, a complete household annihilation, a methodical offender, and a failed prosecution. The crime was neither random chaos nor conclusively personal revenge. It was deliberate, contained, and silent. The victims remain more than names in a file. Josiah and Sarah Moore were parents and business owners. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were schoolchildren with daily routines. Lena and Ine Stillinger were guests staying overnight after a church event. Their lives extended beyond the single night for which they are now remembered. The brevity of the attack contrasts with the fullness of the lives it ended. As historians and researchers continue to analyze the case, they often return to the same foundational questions. Did the killer know the family? Did he wait in the attic? Did he board a train before sunrise? Was this one crime among many, or an isolated act carried alone for the remainder of a lifetime? No surviving document answers these questions with certainty. The final outcome remains unchanged. No one was convicted. No definitive identification was made. The legal process reached its limit and stopped. And so the conclusion is not dramatic. There is no final arrest warrant discovered in an archive, no overlooked fingerprint match decades later. There is only the documented sequence of events and the enduring absence at its center. In the early morning hours of June 10, 1912, someone left the Moore house and stepped back into the quiet streets of Villisca. The town would wake to horror. Investigators would search for years. Courts would convene. Theories would multiply. But the individual who moved through those darkened rooms before dawn was never conclusively named. More than a century later, the silence remains intact. The file closes where it began. A date, a place, 8 victims, 1 weapon, and a departure before sunrise that has never been explained.